This department has a legacy of towering personalities, including Professor Lakdawala, in whose honor we have organized today's lecture. Inspired by the big four, whom we like to call as the four pillars of our Bombay School of Economics, Professor Vakil, Professor Dantwala, Professor Lakdawala, and Professor Brahmanand, we rechristened ourselves as the Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy and embarked on a challenging journey to make a mark in the policy making arena. We are honored to welcome Professor Avinash Dixit to deliver today's lecture. Professor Dixit's book on optimization in economic theory was the most insightful book of math in eco when I was a student, and continues to be the most insightful book for our students today. To have you with us, Professor Dixit, it's indeed a dream come true. It's indeed a privilege to welcome Dr. Urjit Patel, former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, as chairperson for today's lecture. The ties of our department with the Reserve Bank of India are strong and go way back to the first endowment chair, which was instituted in a university and held by none other than Professor P.R. Brahmanand. In fact, I think we are the only university department which boasts of two endowment chairs from the Reserve Bank of India. A pleasure to have you here, sir. Um, Happy to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Vijay Kelkar, the chairman of our board of management of the department. Dr. Kelkar's enthusiasm and drive is very infectious. It has worked wonders for our department and for me personally. Uh, the kind of push that I get, which is gentle but firm. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us, and welcome. Very happy to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Sunil Lakdawala, the son of Professor D.T. Lakdawala, who is with us here today. Delighted to welcome several former directors and senior faculty members of the department. I consider myself as singularly fortunate for being being showered with blessings and affection. Most of them are my teachers, and they continue to look upon me with a great deal of affection. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to many of our alumni who have joined in from across the miles. Formalizing this alumni association of our department, I think, is something that I'm quite proud of having achieved in my tenure as director. I acknowledge and sincerely thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Swati Raju, for having taken this initiative forward and reached its culmination, where we now have a formally registered alumni association. I think having this association will do wonders for the department as we move ahead on the challenging future in the changing environment. A big welcome to teacher colleagues from across the colleges of the city of Mumbai. It's their enthusiasm and support which drives us and keeps us going. Finally, and most importantly, a big welcome to our students. You are our motivation for doing all this and the reason why we keep going. Uh, Before I hand over the proceedings and we go further, I'll make a short presentation on Professor Lakdawala, in whose honor we have organized today's lecture. So just a minute, give me a minute to share the screen, please. Uh, So Professor Lakdawala was one of our four pillars of the Bombay School of Economics, professors who left an imprint on the economic policy making in the country. Professor C.N. Vakil, founder director of the department. Uh, his work is acknowledged, and he has been acknowledged as one of the foremost economists of India. In fact, Dr. C.D. Deshmukh has gone on record to say that it was his work which resulted in a public outcry against inflation and corrective measures. Professor M.L. Dantwala, Doyen of Agricultural Economics, first chairman of the Agricultural Prices Commission. Professor D.T. Lakdawala, on whom I will speak in greater detail in the slides to come, he was the deputy chairman of Planning Commission. Professor P.R. Brahmanand and his work on wage goods model continues to hold the attention of economic debates that continue today. A little more about Professor Lakdawala. He was a product of the Bombay School of Economics, did his MA, PhD, and was appointed as a lecturer in the department. This is PhD under Professor C.N. Vakil, where he on justice in taxation in India with special reference to Gujarat. He was considered as an authority on public finance and international economics, was the director of the department, recipient of the Dadabhai Nauroji Award on 2 occasions, and the chairman or deputy chairman of Planning Commission. He was either a chairman or member of several committees that I have listed out over here. His major contribution to policy making was in the Consumer Price Index. He examined the expenditure pattern of the working class in Bombay City in 63 and recommended readjustments in the existing Consumer Price Index. His report, The New Consumer Price Index Series and Working Class in 89, was released in 90, and Professor L.K. Deshpande, former director of the department and student of Professor Lakdawala, prepared this landmark report. Most of the time, Professor L.K. Deshpande is with us, but today I'm not sure if he is. If he is, then Professor Deshpande, referring to you here. Thank you for this. In 1989, there was an expert group which was set up by the Planning Commission to review the methodology for poverty estimation, which was chaired by Professor Lakdawala. His untimely demise meant that he could not sign the report. The report was signed by Professor Dandekar, but it continues to go under the name of Professor Lakdawala. As chairman of the standing committee, he put out the first survey of research in economics, and he was the general editor of 7 volumes of these surveys, which was sponsored by the ICSSR. He was an ardent advocate of decentralized planning, and I quote, decentralization is essential for the success of development efforts, and it's no longer, uh, and it's no use transferring functions and powers unless we transfer wherewithals with which to discharge these functions. A statement which echoes our sentiments even today. Another facet of Professor Lakdawala was that he was an institution builder. He was the founder director of the Sardar Patel Institute of Economic and Social Research in Ahmedabad and the first chairman of the Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi. Both these are premier research institutes. There's an annual lecture series which was instituted by, in fact, the Planning Commission in the Institute of Social Sciences. Finally, a small peek into Professor Lakdawala as a person, and I quote Professor Sandesara, where he says, Lakdawala's home, a small flat near Chowpatty in Bombay, was an open house. One could go there at any time for any work. The hospitality of the family of Lakdawala, his wife Chandrabala Ben, and his sister Urmila Ben was legendary. The visitor was invariably served a plate full of snacks and tea, and the family insisted that the visitor did full justice to the serving. Exemption was granted only when the guest pleaded medical grounds. So this then was our distinguished Professor Lakdawala, and we are honored to have instituted a lecture in his memory. And it's a great honor that Professor Avinash Dixit has agreed to deliver this 4th Professor Lakdawala Memorial Lecture. With this, I will now hand over the proceedings to Professor Abhay Pethe to do a formal introduction, Professor Urjit Patel and Professor Avinash Dixit. Over to you. Great.
Thank you, Mala. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Urjit Patel, who has kindly agreed to chair today's talk. Dr. Patel has had a stellar academic and professional career. After early education in Nairobi, where he was born, he graduated from London School of Economics, did his MPhil from Linacre College, Oxford, and then moved to Yale, from where he obtained his PhD under the guidance of two famous professors, T.N. Srinivasan and William Wilter. Professionally, he has managed desks of several countries, including the India desk, especially during the crisis years of 91 to 94. In the private sector, he has worked with Boston Consulting Group as an advisor and briefly with Reliance as an advisor in energy and infrastructure. He has had stints at Reserve Bank of India and deputation from IMF and as a consultant to Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India. He has been a member of several high-powered committees. Chief amongst them have to do with Competition Commission, State Electricity Board, PM's Task Force on Infrastructure, Civil Aviation, and many others. Later, he assumed the charge as a backpacking deputy governor at Reserve Bank of India, a novelty in the hierarchical Reserve Bank of India, and made many heads turn. Because there, typically, when the Sahib comes, the Subedar snatches the briefcase away. To avoid that embarrassment, he probably used the backpack. After that, as is well known, he assumed the role of God, because in Bombay, Reserve Bank of India governor is God, just as in Delhi, the finance secretary is one. When he took over as the 24th governor of the Reserve Bank of India in September 2016, during the tumultuous times of demonetization. He is now the chairman of NIPFP, the premier academic think tank of Finance Ministry, Government of India, and also a member of the search committee of the important Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India. Recently, he has published a book, a rather academic one, looking at economy policy issues, called The Overdraft, Saving the Indian Saver. Given his abrupt resignation, some would have expected it to be a spicy tell-all. But rather it turned out to be a cool surgical analysis of the famous trilemma and the loopholes in the IBC, complete with theorems and lemmas, mercifully in the appendix. He does mention the pressure of corporate lobbies that tussle between Finance Ministry and the Reserve Bank and softening of the regulator, but without taking names. Dignified character that he is, he desists from mentioning any names or specific episodes. Like a true public intellectual, he understands the limits of public policy for him to use this platform for settling individual scores. A man, I would say, with remarkable sang-froid indeed. May I once again reiterate how lucky we are to have him in the chair today for today's lecture. Let me now turn to the speaker of the day, the preeminent economist, Professor Avinash Dixit. Professor Dixit was born in Mumbai and got his BSc degree in mathematics from St. Xavier's College. Proud to say that he is a fellow Xavierite. He then moved to Cambridge University, Corpus Christi in particular, where he obtained his BA in mathematics. I must specially point out here that he was a senior wrangler, which means first amongst first, a very, very rare special honor indeed. He obtained his PhD from MIT, supervised by the formidable Professor Robert Solow, a remarkable pedigree. I may also mention that many of his students have become eminent economists in their own rights. I'll just mention two of them, Dr. Vijay Kerkar, who is in the audience and who is the chairman, as Mala mentioned, of our board, and Danny Roderick. He has been the John F. Sherrod University Professor of Economics and since 2010, Emeritus Professor at Princeton. He is also a distinguished adjunct professor at Lingnam University, Hong Kong, and a senior fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. Previously, he has taught at UC Berkeley and Balliol College, Oxford, as also at Warwick. His scholarship extends across the so-called fields in economics. When queried about his effortless traverse, he says that he looks at economics as an integrated whole, and he looks at interesting questions that jump out at him from what is going on around him and what he's reading, and then thinks about how to apply the techniques and the economic theory to apply to them and to sort them out. The wide range and the scope of his interests and contribution is truly astounding. From purely analytical contribution to international trade, to political economy, to new geography, to law and organizational and institutional economics, and many more arenas. The facility of his work has been truly germinal and path-breaking. Like with all great ideas, he manages somehow to keep posing the problem and the explanation of the solution quite simple without encumbering it with unnecessary complications and jargon. In cricketing parlance, he's one of those masters who makes a difficult catch look very ever so simple. It is no surprise that many awards have come his way. He has been elected to the Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences. He has been awarded the first ever CES award from Center for Economic Studies, University of Munich. He has been the president of Econometric Society and the president of American Economic Society. He has been the recipient of many honorary LLDs and DLiTs. In 2016, he was awarded Padma Vibhushan, which is the second highest civil award in India. In all of these well-deserved awards and accolades, he has somehow managed to avoid getting the Nobel Prize. Although it may not matter to him much, it is our ardent wish that this will be rectified very soon in the near future. With this, may I now request Dr. Urjit Patel to chair the proceedings and invite Professor Dixit to deliver the Lakdawala Memorial Lecture with one small announcement. Please do not unmute and speak at the end of the lecture. Please do not present or anything like that because it disturbs. What you will do is use the chat box to write down these questions that you will have, and the chairperson will then moderate and pick them up at the end should we have the time, and he will then ask those questions on your behalf. With that, it's all yours, Dr. Patel.
Thank you, Professor Pate, for that fine introduction. May I now request Professor Avinash Dixit to deliver his lecture. Professor Dixit, you will have to unmute yourself.
I'm trying to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working.
I'm unmuted. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I will now try to go to my slides. Let's see. Okay, can people see the slides?
Yes, Professor Dixit, we can see.
Okay, very good. So, okay, then let me start. And first of all, of course, thank you so much, Professor Pete, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Professor Lalwani, and all of your colleagues for inviting me to give this lecture. And Dr. Patel, thank you so much for agreeing to chair. All a great honor for me. And of course, a great pleasure and honor to be speaking at my alma mater. I was actually a mathematics major and a physics minor, and so never had the pleasure and privilege of studying under Professor Lakdawala, but I've heard uniformly high praises for him from many of his former students. So it is a very special honor to be giving a lecture in his memory. My subject is corruption, actually one very specific part of it, namely how students and young people, who I hope are a majority of the audience, can make a big contribution to the fight against corruption. In India, I'm sure all of you have had some experience personally of corruption. Mine came in the early 1960s when I was preparing all the kind of documentation, etc., that was necessary to travel to England for my further education. I had to visit many offices to get a passport, to get a certificate that I didn't owe any taxes, so on and so on. At every office, the chaprasi guarding the door would ask me if I had an authorization signature from Mr. C.D. Deshmukh. This was a code. Mr. Deshmukh had been the governor of the Reserve Bank, and his signature appeared on the 10 rupee note. And so the guy was just asking for 10 rupees to let me in. I was wondering how that plays out these days in all the offices around the country. Probably they ask for Dr. Patel's signature, and I'm sure it's no longer on a 10 rupee note, but maybe on a 500 rupee note. So I don't really need to convince you that corruption is a substantial problem, but it's useful to go through just a couple of setup things. The usual definition of corruption is the use of public office for private gain. But again, there are kind of shades around that. So all of these kind of definitions I'm giving, don't try and take them to be really exact, like the definition of a meter in physics or anything like that. They're really conceptual categories. And the spectrum of corruption is very often split into 2 or 3 types. There's petty bribery, the kind that most ordinary citizens come across in their daily lives, and that can be an extortion, money demanded for something that should come to you for free or for a very nominal fee, like a driver's license, or it can be a special favor. When you're coming back from abroad, if you're bringing in items a little bit above the duty-free allowance, the customs official can wave you through in exchange for a bit of money, or very often kind of a fraction of what you're bringing. Middle-level corruption is more important for businesses, and that takes the form of payments or kickbacks for getting government licenses or contracts. And then finally, there's the grand corruption, where basically you're capturing the government or its agencies, getting laws made to favor you, regulations changed, etc. Again, the boundaries are vague, overlaps. So, for example, a very large license may not be all that distinct from having a monopoly award, which would count as grand corruption. Also, if petty corruption prevails, then people can get into a frame of mind that that's the way things are, and that can gradually pave the way for mid-level or grand corruption. Corruption doesn't even have to be a spot deal of whatever it is in exchange for cash. That would be a kind of direct, immediate quid pro quo. And as you hear the Trump administration in the US very often claim, no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo, but you know what's going on. And ultimately, even without any kind of direct traits, the whole society can be favoring insiders. That even happens in supposedly squeaky clean countries like Scandinavian countries. So healthcare is available in principle for free to everybody. But if you want a really good doctor or surgeon to treat you, you need a connection. And elites have those connections and ordinary people don't. So all kinds of complicated things going on that are some aspects of corruption. What about its effects? Again, I probably don't need to tell you. The standard thing they say is that corruption is like a tax. It reduces economic activity below its Pareto efficient level. But it's worse than that because of the uncertainty involved. Unlike a tax, you don't know what the rate of taxation implicit in corruption is going to be. And you can get new demands from the same official or repeated demands from other officials. And that uncertainty, like uncertainty in anything, is a big deterrent, particularly for investment and innovation. Some people counter this claim by saying that if regulations themselves are bad and are keeping economic activity below optimal levels, then corruption can, so to speak, grease the gears of bureaucracy and bring things closer to the optimum. But at most, this is a second best argument. It would be better to get rid of the inefficient regulations in the first place. And also, a lot of people in a lot of countries have examined this empirically and find that there's not a great deal of support for it. The importance of reducing or close to eliminating corruption and good governance more generally is especially important for a country to go beyond middle income levels, because that's when you need to expand the scope and scale of economic activity to a point where you have to deal with other people who are not in your immediate circles of trust. And for that, you need formal institutions to be of high enough quality. And therefore, for many of these countries with acronyms, BRICS, Mint, and all that, and certainly for India, it's especially important. So how do you do it? Corruption is a very complex, multidimensional problem, as I said earlier, and correspondingly, many different institutions, organizations, etc., have been used to combat it in many countries, many times. This could be the state's formal legal system. It could be anti-corruption agencies that have been set up for the purpose somewhat independently from the government. And then can be various community associations which have links with the other two, but operate in a more social, outside of the law way. And to succeed, you need a combination of things. I'll give some examples. There are many more examples in the couple of papers that are listed in references in the very last slide. But usually you need combinations of these different methods and coalitions between the organizations at different levels. And even if you do all of that, at best, you will succeed only partially. I like to say that the fight against corruption should be thought of not like cancer, where you have to get rid of every malignant cell, otherwise the few that remain will grow and grow. Think of it rather like combating overweight or obesity. It's hard. You succeed only partially toward your goal. Sometimes you go on a feast and regress, but it's important to keep some effort going, some dieting, some exercise to get your body in a fitter state and maybe make the next steps a little bit easier. And that brings me to what in some ways is my most important point. You shouldn't expect governments to do the whole job, because after all, politicians and officials in the government system are the biggest gainers from corruption. They will usually resist reform, and where they're compelled to, they'll make weak laws, enforce them weakly, etc. And sometimes I'll give a couple of examples. They are obstacles, not solutions to the problem of corruption. Correspondingly, we, citizens, firms, etc., are on balance net losers. We are paying over money or other kinds of things, and collectively, we are getting the same things that we would have got had nobody paid anything. But of course, collectively hides a lot of distributional things. Some people are gaining from corruption at the expense of others. Everybody has a temptation to be that gainer. And when we all do that, we cancel each other out. Of course, all economists instantly say, prisoner's dilemma. That's true. There can be other forms of games that come up, and I'll mention a couple of them later. Also, we should recognize that we are not on all equal footing in this. Some people, some groups are better organized or better connected. And it's the less favored, the less connected, that need more of the collective action. This is a standard kind of thing in game theory that's usually not told in formal treatments of the theory. Namely, strategy is much more important for the underdogs. Those who are top dogs, they're already there. They don't need to strategize so much. So it's for ordinary people that good strategizing in fighting corruption is important. So today I'm going to say a little bit about whether and how self-enforcing community action can counter corruption. I'll give some examples, a couple of models to frame our thinking. I'm not going to do any math today. There'll be a couple of slides where I'll mention these models verbally. And those of you who want to pursue the math, again, there are papers in the last slide that will give references. And as I said, I'll emphasize the role that young people can play. What are the kinds of methods that have been observed? Again, I'll just give a listing. Examples in detail are in the papers. Some methods are top-down, where the top leadership makes laws, etc. And others are bottom-up. There are social movements, public media, social media, etc. I'll argue that pure top-down methods are very rare and have to be supplemented by important bottom-up movements. Then there's a difference between ex-ante methods and ex-post methods. Ex-ante methods include proper selection of agents who will be trained, indoctrinated, enculturated in the bureaucracy to at least reduce the level of corruption and to deter corruption through fear of what might happen to you or your own innate morals or norms. And then there are ex post methods to detect corruption when it happens and to punish it. Again, these are not meant to be rivals. In practice, you need to combine them and build coalitions of the different groups, different top-down and bottom-down methods, etc. And ultimately, what you need to do to succeed is to change the culture of society, the values, the beliefs, the expectations, correspondingly the behavior and actions that people take under the influence of these values that have been ingrained into them. You need to change the equilibrium of the underlying game. There are many examples where this has happened in countries, and it'd be useful to go through just a couple of them. One of my favorite of bottom-up methods is the movement called the Addio Pizzo in Sicily. Sicilian mafia extorted businesses through something called the pizzo, which were regular payments you made for protection, of course, from the mafia itself, as it were. One day, like almost 20 years ago now, a group of young people started this movement called Addio Pizzo, goodbye to pizza. They recruited businesses to take a pledge that they did not pay the pizza. And this was done by showing a decal on the door. And consumers, the ordinary citizens, were encouraged to patronize those businesses. Of course, business might be tempted to get that decal and then pay the pizza anyway. They had methods of detecting and throwing out businesses. Some were thrown out like that. They arranged, like smart young people, very good slogans, very good publicity. The mafia had the standard thing that it was beneath the honor and dignity of people to talk to the police. These young people turned it around and said it was beneath the honor and dignity of Sicilians to pay pizza. This has been going on for like now 12, 15 years, and they've had modest success. So research studies show that something like 10% of businesses signed up. Not much, but the very important thing is that so far the mafia has not retaliated. If just as an ordinary single business person, you refuse to pay the pizza, your store would be burned down or smashed up. You might even be killed. But nothing has happened to businesses showing these decals or to leaders of this youth movement who actually reveal themselves in public. The police who were monitoring mafia phone calls actually heard the mafiosi complain that this movement was costing them a lot, but they didn't retaliate for fear of public outrage. This movement has had better success among newer businesses, younger consumers, younger workers, and so there's some hope that this will form a virtuous circle where the older people who are used to the culture of the mafia will gradually die out, and the younger Addio Pizzo people will take over. The key thing about Addio Pizzo is the collectivity. You are showing from that decal not only that you will not pay pizza, but that you are a member of a movement. And if anybody retaliates against you, the whole movement will be at their back. The same kind of thing has been attempted, I believe, not to a great deal of success in India. There's this 0 rupee note where if a policeman or somebody demands a small bribe, you hand this over. And giving that 0 rupee note says more than merely refusing to pay. It says implicitly that I belong to an organization that will fight you. Very different kind of example, Hong Kong. There was a big scandal in 1973 where a British high-level police officer was found to be very corrupt. He escaped to Britain, but was extradited, brought back, imprisoned. And that led to a big outrage. Recently appointed new governor for Hong Kong set up this independent commission against corruption and backed it strongly. Initially, it met a lot of resistance from the police and from the civil service. There were actually fistfights between police and the overseers of the ICAC. But gradually, the commission acquired reputation with a very active campaign of public relations, of education. School teachers were enlisted to teach good values to school children. So this was a kind of very nice mix of top-down and bottom-up and formation of coalitions. Few other examples. Singapore is one of the very rare examples of an almost purely top-down anti-corruption drive. Lee Kuan Yew took a very firm stance, and he was kind of important enough, powerful enough in that small society that he was able to get his way. Examples of Western Europe, US, etc. Fights went on against corruption over decades, sometimes over centuries, and they involved progressive movements, investigative journalists, sometimes crises. The story of Denmark is that they disastrously lost a war, and that impoverished their, or took power away from their aristocracy to a point where the royalty was then able gradually to start a civil service, etc. And I find that very interesting. Nowadays, Denmark lists almost at the top of corruption-free countries listings. And it amuses me to think how things have changed since Shakespeare's time. And now there's almost nothing rotten in the state of Denmark. There are a lot of recent examples of anti-corruption agencies in former socialist economies, and they were very mixed set of results. Again, I'll leave you to read details of that. I'll capture a couple, three of them in the next set of slides. But one thing I want to drive home is that to learn from history, you have to get examples of both successes and failures. You cannot learn secrets of success by looking only at examples of successes. Okay, so what does this research roughly show? What must anti-corruption agencies and similar organizations do? They will meet a lot of opposition, a lot of obstructions from politicians, officials, etc., etc. And to overcome that, they have to maintain their own integrity, their own reputation. Nothing should be allowed to sully that, and if any problems come up, they should be stamped on and gotten rid of very quickly. They should build alliances with other parts of society, with media, with civil society, with international institutions, with educational institutions to shape the public's culture and expectations. They have to have a balance between aggressively pursuing big cases. If they don't that, people will think they're doing nothing. But they also have to combine that with a slower, more low-profile strategy of having social campaigns, educational campaigns. And they shouldn't try to go too far. Shouldn't have a zero-tolerance approach. That proves to be a mistake. That's my cancer versus obesity analogy again. If you're forming a community institution, you should know that you can't rely on the government, but there are parts of government that will help you. Join them wherever possible. A business community can have self-governing norms and sanctions. They can have good methods of detecting corruption, better than those from the government usually, because they have inside information. And they can enforce sanctions on their own members. For example, refuse to deal with them in their internal contracts and trades. And in doing all this, have to remember they're individually helpless, but jointly powerful. People will say, hey, what can I do when a civil servant or a policeman or what have you demands a bribe? You singly cannot do anything. get together with 10,000 others or 100,000 others, you're powerful. And it's the policeman or civil servant whose power goes down. Such a community institutions should not be an insider's clique and should not extract rents by itself, should avoid false accusation. Their internal detection methods have to be proof against both type 1 and type 2 errors as far as is possible. Again, they should cultivate links wherever possible. Their members should volunteer to speak in schools, colleges, etc. Again, especially among youth, to create a culture where it's not just the way things are done, but there's something of a shame about being corrupt. People should at least begin by starting to feel ashamed. And correspondingly, they should take pride in being clean. They should take pride when your country goes up in rankings in the international tables of governance. Public media campaign, social media campaign, all these kind of things can take part in that. So let me say just a little bit about two models that will give you a way of thinking about this. One is the prisoner's dilemma model that I mentioned. That's pretty obvious. Business community and citizenry collectively is a net loser, but individuals can gain at the expense of others by participating in the corrupt system. So, as the work of Elinor Ostrom and others has shown, community organizations can do a lot to overcome this kind of a prisoner's dilemma by having its internal norm, which would be that no bribery to win a contract or a license will be tolerated. And the sanction should be that someone who's found to be violating is ostracized by the consumers and other businesses. Now, my theoretical model with its numerical calculations shows that this proves complementary to the state's legal system for tackling middle-level corruption, in that if both of them are in operation, the effect is better than the sum of the separate parts. Each reinforces the other. However, actually some business people in India told me that it wasn't quite as bad as that. Prisoner's dilemma, despite what work of Ostrom, etc. showed, are often hard to resolve, particularly for large groups. But these people point out to me that it might be more of a coordination game, stag hunt, or assurance type model. In that, if all the other firms are corruption free, then it might be better for you to be clean also, because you have a reputation that you can attract and retain the smartest and the most productive young employees. These business people said that, especially among the young recruit, there's a lot of shame about joining a corrupt company. And those who were trying to be clean were able to attract the smartest. Smart firms can be favored by consumers. There are examples of this in things like environmental work that firms do. They are able to attract consumers and profit more. And this kind of a game, then, as you know from your games, has two equilibria. One where everybody is corrupt, so there is no shame in being corrupt and you might as well be corrupt. But also an equilibrium in which everybody is clean and then being clean has advantage for you privately also. You need to build momentum gradually to push past the tipping point between these two equilibria, which will then lead to a self-sustaining, positive movement toward the good equilibrium. Of course, to work this, and in fact also to work the prisoner's dilemma type system to have norms and sanctions, you need reliable common knowledge. You need to know which are the clean firms, which are the corrupt firms. And my suggestion is that a business community or maybe young people should develop something like a Michelin star system for restaurants. There can be firms that have 3 stars, squeaky clean, very smart people to work with, favored by consumers, and correspondingly lower down 2 star, 1 star, or even no star. So these models do help focus thinking. Directly, they're more at the petty and middle levels of corruption. They're not directly addressing the grand level. But the hope is that success at these lower levels will gradually change people's attitude, will change culture, and turn opinion against the grand level of corruption. And of course, even then, again, the cancer and obesity analogy, shouldn't expect fast success, shouldn't expect 100% success. Let me come back and say something specific about what youth can do. You can take part in a lot of these things, for example, by favoring the cleaner firms in your job search and your purchase decisions. Patronize the clean firms, apply to selectively the clean firms, and pressure your parents, your elders, other fellow youth to do likewise. Maybe even create a kind of sense of shame. How could you work for company X? Don't you know that they're terrible and corrupt? And create a sort of sense of shame about being corrupt. You have good tech skills. You can take part in developing a rating scheme that will identify clean firms, something like the Michelin system I mentioned. You can have a website where corruption is exposed. So, for example, you can have body cams or even your smartphones, and a policeman stops you and wants to extort a fine from you. Take a quick photo, which instantly goes and sits on that website. And of course, the policeman might smash your camera, but it's too late. It'll be even worse for him because the photo is already there. You need an app that will send that photo instantly to the exposure website. Of course, you can vote for politicians who will actually drain the swamp, not just talk about draining the swamp. Donald Trump was talking a lot about draining the swamp in Washington in 2016, and what he did in his administration seems to be exactly the opposite of that. So we'll vote for politicians who will actually take actions. You can campaign for those kind of politicians. You can, in fact, yourself run against the corrupt politicians. There's a lot you can do. You have the energy, you have the knowledge, you have the skills, and I believe you have the motivation. So let me just quickly conclude. As I said, corruption is more of an obstacle for countries that want to go beyond middle income levels. That's squarely India. They can't wait for governments to do the job. Business groups and citizens groups should take the lead, have coalitions with all kinds of things, media, non-governmental organizations, etc., and work to change the culture. This is a slow process. Outcomes will be far from perfect, but I keep saying, don't wait for 100% perfect solution to emerge. Don't say, oh, this method is not going to work 100%, so let's not use it. If you do that, you will only ensure getting 0%. Getting 25% or even 10% is much better than that 0%. So I thank you so much for listening, and India will thank you for whatever inspiration you get, whatever actions you take. So this last slide has a lot of the detailed references, and you can follow them up. I hope at some point the university will put up these slides on a website where you will be able to get them easily enough. So thanks again, and I'll take this off.
So we'll move on to the question answers. Dr. Patel.
Oh, anyway, just to ask quickly, what's that? Okay, because my presentation is still showing mute. Were people able to hear me?
Yes, it
Yes.
was crystal clear.
Okay, very good. All right, so I'll mute myself now.
Should I take the
Yes, Dr. Patel.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Lalwani. Thank you, Professor Dixit. So there are several questions that have been put in the chat box. Let me start with the conceptual one that one of the listeners has typed out. He says, well, it's actually Professor Abhay Patel, actually. He says that you have mentioned a typology of corruption. Do you have a strategic sequencing in mind to tackle them?
Oh, no, actually, am I muted or no?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
So the typology is conceptual with links across. Now, it's certainly true that grand corruption is hardest to tackle. So given a choice, I would probably start at the petty and middle levels and try and build up the culture and the norms of society to a point where we can make some dent in the grand corruption. But I think petty and middle level ones can be tackled simultaneously using somewhat different methods of the kind that I outlined, but there need not be a kind of strategic sequencing, start with petty, then middle.
Okay. Yeah. There is a question from Pooja Divulkar. How effective do you think would the use of artificial intelligence and related technology be in making processes relatively clean and reducing corruption?
Oh, interesting question, and not one that I've explicitly thought about in the AI context, but AI needs a lot of data. And to get that data, you have, first of all, to detect examples of corruption and feed them in. And then when enough of a data bank results, you might be able to look at kind of associated characteristics of various transactions and say that this was quite likely corrupt. But in the meantime, you do need a detection system of the kind that maybe I was saying that people might be able to create by snapping photographs of corrupt policemen and posting them on the website, or business communities, I'm sure, have a pretty accurate idea of who got a contract by fair methods and who got it by bribery. They can kind of generate their own internal data bank, and when enough of data becomes available, then it may be fed into an AI machine to create kind of attributes that will help you zoom in on what are plausibly corrupt transactions. I hope that helps me.
Thank you, Professor Dixit. There is a question from Rohan Garg, and this is related to some new initiatives taken in India. And he asks, Professor Dixit, according to you, how effective are digitization and faceless assessment by the income tax department in phasing out corruption?
Now that's something that I don't know enough facts about. There are kind of situations where you can pretty quickly eliminate corruption. So I understand that railway reservations and ticketing used to have a lot of corruption, and taking that online made that disappear almost quickly and completely. There may be similar things that could be done in situations of income tax. And there actually, AI might help if you have information about the standard of life of these people simultaneously with their income declarations. This is kind of done in the US, where if the IRS can prove that you are living at a standard that could in no way be justified by your formal income tax statements, then they'll go at least into a great deal of detail and try and catch you on that. I understand that Al Capone was ultimately caught exactly like that for income tax fraud, not for any of the other terrible things he did.
Right. There's a question from Rajat Agarwal. Sir, can there be some mechanisms or models where there are mutually reinforcing ways of conducting operations in public offices in this, possibly in this era of mass digitization? This could be one way.
I'm not 100% sure what kind of thing you have in mind, the questioner, but possibly a little bit related thing comes to mind, which is if you have a business that needs, say, 15 licenses, you can either have a system in which they're supplied by 15 different offices, or a one-stop window where you apply for all 15 at the same time. And the principle is that comparing an oligopolistic versus a monopolistic way of delivering complementary goods, actually a monopoly is better, because they recognize the harmful effects of one on the other. So if license A issuer increases the bribe he demands, that will decrease the demand for licenses A, B, C all alike, and A will not take this into account. If ABC came together into a one-stop shop window, then they will take this effect into account and will not increase their bribe so much. So that's the kind of possibility that comes to mind, but I don't know if that's what the questioner had in mind. If not, perhaps they can come back with a supplementary.
Thank you, Professor Dixit. No, I think that that's a good point. And I think it answers the question, at least in an important perspective regarding number of clearances and offices one has to visit.
I understand that's happening, actually, that one-stop shop arrangements are being instituted in a number of places.
Yeah, the issues, the multiplicity is still, there's still a fair bit of multiplicity because of union government, state government, cities, municipalities, and so on. But conceptually, I think we are moving in the right direction. in several of your slides, you have mentioned the importance of business organizations, and this next question from Vijay Kumar Vadadi is related to that. He says, "How about crony capitalism? Is this not the biggest source of corruption in India? How does one tackle that?"
No, that's an interesting question, because there are kind of two dimensions to that. If the public governance system is bad, if courts are clogged up to a point where to get a contract dispute resolved will take 5 years, then business has to develop its own internal methods of governance, where, for example, if A cheats B, B's friends C, D, E, etc., won't do any business with A. And that, to some extent, relies on internal networks, connections, cronyism, if you like. It's your cronies whom you can rely on not to cheat you so much, because you will be able to badmouth them among your circle of acquaintances. But yeah, when this extends into things that require public licenses, contracts, etc., that starts to become a problem. So I think this is kind of balance, and ultimately it will be definitely better to get rid of cronyism, but to get rid of that successfully, you will need to improve not just corruption, but also other public aspects of governance, contract enforcement, property right protection, etc., in the public sphere.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Professor Dixit, because while our country has improved a fair bit in the overall ease of doing business index, on the enforcement of contract in a relative sense, because these rankings are relative, we have actually gone back a bit over this period when the overall index was going up. When the overall index, we were actually moving up the and in the right direction, but on the enforceability of contract, we still do quite poorly. I think I'll take another couple of questions. One is, does Professor Kaushik Basu's system of decriminalizing bribe giving have an impact on corruption?
I've seen some kind of research done in response to that, and it seems mixed. So I could dig up the references, but probably people can dig them up themselves easily. So I don't have a kind of clear answer to that. The kind of one way in which that's not so good to my mind is that can interfere with what I emphasized again and again, that ultimately you want to change the whole culture. And if it's the case where a situation, even where a person who is helpless in that situation gives a bribe, comes to light, and that's okay, that can interfere to some extent with changing the culture.
Thank you. So there's, I think this will probably be the last question, given we are approaching 7:15. And this is a appropriately global question from Shrivardhini Talule. The current populist wave worldwide has led to denial when it comes to acknowledging corruption. how do you think will it impact such collective efforts that you have suggested?
That's a very good question, and I broadly agree that the way populism has developed in many countries has been hand in glove with increase in corruption at even grand levels, particularly at grand levels. And the only thing that can be done, I think, is to try and fight back against a number of these authoritarian rulers and dictators, expose their malfeasance, and try and develop a different type of populism, if you like. Populism that will want to genuinely favor the large masses of the citizenry, not the oligarchs and business associates of the president.
Thank you, Professor Dixit. I think it's time for Professor Lalwani to conduct a vote of thanks for Professor Dixit for a riveting 1 hour, 20 minutes. I don't know how the time has lapsed, and also the technology gods smiled on us. Everything worked seamlessly, and so this lecture was meant to be at 6 p.m. Today. So, Professor Lalwani, if you can take it over now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have no qualms in admitting that I'm very relieved that today's program has gone through without any technical glitches. So I just have to begin my vote of thanks by thanking the IT department head, Dr. Srevar Mangai, as well as Mr. Hemant Salunke, who has really made this happen for us. He's been in and out, and he's been throwing people out, as I know, as people who have started presenting. So thank you very much, Mr. Hemant Salunke, for doing this for us. No words to thank you, Professor Dixit, for this lecture. It's been thought-provoking, lucid, and a great lesson in what a good teacher should be like. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel, for having agreed to chair this session for us. It's been great having you. Thank you to the audience for having joined in. Of course, the pleasure of sharing tea and snacks with you will have to wait till happier times, which I hope will be very soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.